We'll go ahead and get started. I'm actually really pleased to have up here on stage with me to kind of wrap today's show. A couple of superstars in our own right, and if you could hear the conversations we're having about golf up here, it's pretty amazing actually. So, but this discussion is on the role of policy, technology, and innovation in Texas. And just to my left, I have Marianne Berlinski. She's president of EDF North America, and just to her left is Jimmy Glatfelty, commissioner at the Texas Public Utility Commission. Marianne, Jimmy, thanks for joining us today. I think what we'll do is we'll just get started with some opening remarks and then kind of just dive into a conversation. So, Marianne, why don't you go ahead and take it away?
Sure. So, Marianne Berlinski, I'm president of EDF Energy North America. EDF, Electricité de France, not the Environmental Defense Fund. We get in certain settings, this one in particular, sometimes get confused on why the other EDF might have the opinions and views that I do. So EDF, world's largest producer of low carbon energy. We own and operate 56 nuclear power stations globally, over 160,000 employees, 40 million customers. So a really big company that most Americans have not heard of. In North America, because we do not sell to residential homes under EDF brands, you won't see us on a billboard, we don't do commercials. Our business model in North America is very different than what we do in Europe. Here in North America, I'm responsible for 3 business units, generation services business. So we dispatch over 100 power stations across the country, and we do not own any of them. So if you buy a power plant and you don't know what to do with it, you can hire us. We'll do fuel, scheduling, dispatch, dispute resolution, all that good stuff. I have power trading and natural gas trading, so we're a top 10 power trader, top 10 gas marketer. And then I have a retail business. So our commercial and industrial, we are the 5th largest retailer in the country by volume, 3rd largest C&I book in the country. So our business model is really buying from the source, whether that's a power station or gas from a gas producer, hedge, optimize, trade, and then sell to the end user. So it's an interesting position to be in this market because it's a bit Switzerland-ish, where we don't own the gen, we don't own the manufacturing, we just help get the energy to where it needs to be in the most effective, efficient way possible.
Thank you for having me. Where to start? You know, I guess last August I got appointed to the Public Utility Commission in the wake of the resignations of all the existing commissioners and the legislature expanding the commission to 5 commissioners. So out of the frying pan into the fire, so to speak. And I would say that the frying pan that I was working on before was trying to win a management contract to manage the power system in Puerto Rico. So that was a challenge. This is an even bigger challenge. What we've done since August, really since February a year ago, since the storm, we've focused on how to increase reliability of the power system in ERCOT, resiliency, reliability, economics. We have some challenges going forward in terms of what our market design looks like. But I think all of my colleagues and most people in the legislature and the governor believe that competitive markets are the most robust and the most economic way to serve Texans for their energy use for years to come. So that's our backdrop. Our challenge is to either reform the ERCOT market in the electric space to something that it's not today, or to tweak the edges and see if we can get the same outcome. And that's really the game that we're playing right now. Is we've made some modifications. We have weatherized power plants. We've modified different aspects of the ancillary service market. And now we're going to study some major changes and see if those are necessary to go forward. We're in this we're in this technology change in this space. We changed when Marianne started at Dynegy, I think it was, and I was at Calpine in the 90s and early 2000s. This was the gas industry. These were combined cycle power plants were the most efficient, and they were displacing the coal plants. And now we have renewables displacing the combined cycle plants. There's a resilience issue there and a reliability issue. That's where technology comes in and innovation. So I'm eager to talk about that. I'm glad to be here.
Absolutely, thanks. And I promise we will get knee-deep into resilience and reliability. It's something that most people in this part of the country became all too familiar with a little over a year ago. Just for a level set though, because I don't think everybody fully understands what the PUC does versus what ERCOT does. If you could just provide the 30-second elevator pitch version of that, that would be useful.
Absolutely. We are the economic regulator really for transmission and distribution in the state. So back in the 90s, we started to restructure the market to create wholesale competition and retail competition. So that means what the legislature believed, and Governor Bush at the time, who I worked for, believed that if you didn't have a natural monopoly, then we ought to create competitive markets. Competitive markets became the supplying of electricity to customers and then the generation side. So those two are totally competitive. And we regulate what's in between. And then we regulate the market that they sell into, called ERCOT, that's responsible for managing reliability of the entire system.
Thank you. So the role of technology, policy, innovation, you're both right in the middle of all of that. Kind of in different perspectives, but I think your career arcs are really interesting because you've kind of seen it evolve as well. I wonder if you could talk just briefly, and Mary Ann, I'll start with you. Over the course of your career, where have you seen those 3 points really sort of intersect and sort of drive us to where we are today in terms of discussions around resilience and reliability? And then I'll add to that, you mentioned competitive markets, Jimmy. I would love for both of y'all to sort of dive into that and where you see that sort of fitting into this discussion.
So I've been doing power for a very long time. So Jimmy mentioned my first job in electricity was at Dynegy. They handed me a power station. I had no idea what to do with it. I went to the control room for 2 weeks, brought kolaches, donuts, listened to the operators, figured out what was going on. That was pre-deregulation or pre-competition in Texas. So I actually got to dispatch a power plant with a QF, NEP, FEP tariffs, and then Senate Bill 7. And so started thinking about what does this market look like as we create ways for competition to happen. And it was really very interesting. At Dynegy, we had the first power station that was approved to sell, non-affiliated power station that was allowed to sell ancillary services. And as we came out of that, the amount of creativity and energy and problem solving, and back then, the original pilot, we had 3 zones. The price changed every 15 minutes. In a calendar year, there were 100,000 prices that you could index something to, and we traded and managed all of that in Excel spreadsheets because you could. Last year, there were over 26 million prices in ERCOT that you could index things to. You can no longer do that in Excel. Data management, I mean, you could try, you'd fail miserably. So it really, the big trend here is the granularity at which we can see what's happening on our power grids and the amount of information that we can then take from that raw data and use to make better energy decisions. I would say a couple examples. 15 years ago, I was working, and we were a QSC for third-party power stations, and we got our first wind farm. It was Goat Mountain, and it was 2008, or late 7, early 8, and we were helping them commission and get scheduled into ERCOT. And when that plant was built, it was assumed the wind is going to blow, any megawatts are free, we're just going to let it go. Well, at that point, transmission congestion started to become a real problem, and this crazy thing of negative prices, which you're like, why would a commodity ever print negative? And believe it or not, because the mentality of it's always just going to flow, there were no remote breakers. We had Johnny, and Johnny was in a pickup truck out at Goat Mountain, and he had a satellite phone, and when prices would go negative, the real-time desk would call Johnny, and he'd go open the breaker. And you think how far the wind industry has come to where pitching blades and automation, it is And it's not that long, when you're thinking utility time scale, it's not that long of a time differential from building a wind farm, set it, forget it, to a fully integrated system that allows you to help manage that. Fast forward 2 years, we were working with another customer that's no longer in existence. AES Deepwater is a pet coke plant on the Ship Channel, and they wanted to try battery out. And so they had a 1 megawatt battery, and in ERCOT, we love our acronyms, and there's a form you have to fill out called a RARF, and Resource Asset Registration Form. And so we pull up this RARF form, and we're looking, and resource type, and it's gas and nuclear and coal and wind, but there is no battery storage drop down. So it was, okay, well, how do we register a battery? It's not been done in ERCOT before. So went to ERCOT. Trip Doggett was the CEO at the time. Said, hey, Trip, we need to figure out how to get this battery on so we can see response time and how it can fit into ancillary services. So I think part of the job of industry, because we do tend to see what's cool and innovative and the technology advances that are happening, going and educating our friends at ERCOT and at the PUC and saying, hey, we've got this new technology and we think it's going to respond faster than a traditional power station can. How do we get it registered to participate? And so, I'm an engineer originally by background, and I do believe that these challenges, hydrogen, we've got really smart people working on solving these things, and never underestimate the power of some fantastically brilliant people who are all aligned in trying to solve these kinds of problems.
Boy, I agree entirely with that statement. I'm surrounded with them every day here at Rice. Some of the students I get to interact with are just brilliant, and I'm just waiting for them to come up with the next great idea to solve the world's next problem. So great comment. Jimmy?
Well, from my view, technology and policy are kind of drivers behind a lot of what's happening in the market and what has happened. So obviously I talked about the technology going from coal plants to combined cycle plants, now to wind and solar plants and batteries. Where I see the biggest transformation happening is really on the demand side. So forever, this industry has always been a supply side industry. It's all of the generators. That means that everybody in this room and everybody, in ERCOT, every time you flip the switch, you're expecting your lights to come on. Really agnostic as to what the price is, because you don't really know when you flip the switch. You just get a bill 30 days later. But what's happening is the technology in terms of solar technology, in terms of battery technology that can be at the distribution system, that can be at your residence, that can be time of use, types of products, is really changing the equation in the supply and demand mix. And we are really at the tip of the iceberg on this. The Public Utility Commission and ERCOT have not modified as many things as we need to in order to take full advantage of that. That is going to be a very big game changer for different types of consumers, industrial, commercial, and residential consumers in different ways. They will get paid for either not using or for selling excess back to the system at different prices for different times. All of these take systems and technology and really smart people to make it happen. But the innovation is out there. Some of these technologies have been out there for 20 years or 30 years. The policy is way far behind. So we are getting pushed. I think the Winter Storm Uri was actually a very good, it was a good push to make sure that we adopt some of these new technologies sooner rather than later. And I'm excited for the demand side, and I'm really excited for transmission technologies. I'm a transmission guy at heart, and I believe that we need to be better stewards of the right-of-way that we have, and that means new technologies on our conductors, new conductors, higher capacity lines, DC lines, all of these things that can make the system and the rights-of-way that we have more efficient to use, because our population is going to grow to by 2040 and 2050, it's going to double. So we have to be better stewards of that resource.
That's a great point. Just thinking about load and demand as a resource that actually came up, in the very first session this morning. Just thinking about the efficiencies that can bring. So both of you referred to, Marianne, you referenced, trying to put a battery on the grid and having to go to ERCOT and say, how do we actually do this? Jimmy, you mentioned policy sort of lagging technology. I wonder if you could maybe expand a little bit on that front and just kind of walk us through, if you have something that you want to introduce to an existing grid and there's not really necessarily that regulatory architecture in place, what does that process look like?
It's very fluid. I think part of what's super interesting when you're doing energy, and over the last 20 years I've seen it countless times, is there's not necessarily always a clear path through the forest. You gotta blaze a trail, and sometimes it's best often when you bring the commercial team, the regulatory folks, and your customers together, and then go talk to the regulators. And I do think when you look back over time, the innovation does tend to happen faster than the rules can keep up with it. I think one of the unintended consequences of Uri, Griddy, which was a demand side, all have probably heard of Griddy. I was a Griddy customer for a very long time, right until the week before the storm. But it's 20,000 people in a state the size of Texas that were on Griddy, and we talk a lot about making it. It's now against you're not allowed to sell a wholesale market index to a residential customer. Instead of talking about, well, why did we have $9,000 prices for multiple days? I mean, that was if you'd asked us what is in the realm of the possible, it was our worst case scenarios that we were running on the trade floor was a couple hours, not days at $9,000. So how you incentivize your loads to really participate, as well as your gen, because I do agree with Jimmy, I think this next piece is going to be very demand driven. We sell a lot of electricity to large industrials, and in Texas we have roughly 3,000 megs of load, and you can see our chart in February where actually before the storm hit and prices started to come up, you saw our industrial demand drop from 3,000 to 2,000 to 1,000 megawatts. So we saw 2/3 of the load came off in response to price. Now, it wasn't enough, clearly, to help combat the impact of the storm, but one of the facts that bothers me a lot is, the night, Sunday night coming into Monday morning, ERCOT estimates there was over 1,000 megawatts of pool pump load running in ERCOT. It was a winter storm. It was freezing. My husband and I had 2 arguments the week of the storm. The first was about the pool pump. And I said, go out there, and I said, here's a YouTube video. It's not hard. Drain the pool pump and the heater. Well, we have freeze guard. I was like, honey, freeze guard only works when the electricity is running, and I think there's a really good chance we're gonna have some outages. And he's like, I'll go do it after the power goes out. And so at 2 o'clock in the morning, he's in the backyard with a flashlight. It's freezing, cursing, trying to figure out how to drain the pool pump. But I do think that a lot of it is educating, making it easy. I mean, to think 1,000 megawatts of pool pump load in a winter storm event, that's a lot of homes that could have been kept online had we been proactive in managing a different way than freeze guard.
Some of that's just about education, right? Yeah, absolutely. Jimmy?
So I think your question about how you get new technologies integrated into the system is very hard, unfortunately. It's hard at the ISO, at the independent system operator level. I've historically said that RTOs, regional transmission operators, are places where projects go to die. They are lowest common denominator. So you have to go and you can have a great grand idea that can change the world, and it will get dumbed down to something that really doesn't mean anything. And you'll be fighting that battle for years to come. I think in ERCOT, we've kind of changed that dynamic a little bit, because we've gone from a stakeholder board. The legislature in Senate Bill 3 this last session changed the structure of ERCOT from a stakeholder board, where it really became lowest common denominator kind of actions that would take place, to an independent board where they are going to be looking out for consumers and the entirety of the market. We have some really great professionals on there. John Swainson, who ran the software business for Dell Computer, incredibly smart. He's kind of, taking apart the software upgrade process at ERCOT. Really, ERCOT is a big IT company, quite frankly. They do meeting management and they do IT. And they probably have more people in meeting management than they do IT, which was, probably reverse. But they are looking at ways that we can upgrade this market system technology much quicker, much faster, so that these problems that Marianne talked about, and mine is a simple one. I asked them, if you have a power plant that trips offline, and you haven't planned for it to go offline, it's called a forced outage. Within a certain amount of time, you have to go into the forced outage notification system that ERCOT has and type in what happened. There's no way that you can go back and modify that. So almost 50% of the outages on the thermal fleet is for an unknown reason. So we can't go back and look at our fleet and figure out what the problems are because we don't have any real indication, and we can't, the market participants aren't able to go back in and modify that. That was one of the first things that I asked them in August of last year, and it's going to take at least another 9 or 12 months to get fixed. Not necessarily because it's hard to fix that, but they're in the midst of changing out a system. So they don't want to fix it in one system and then change it out for another system. All of that is going to make it easier once it gets fixed. And we're eventually, I believe, going to go to, these markets are going to be software as a service, and that model is going to make it a lot easier to update things, modify pricing, modify ancillary services, and make our system much more responsive to new technologies.
That's really interesting. Y'all both use the word responsiveness either directly or indirectly. And Marianne, you referenced the amount of data that's available now and how that actually does inform operations in ways that it didn't 20 years ago. And that's just 20 years, by the way. As we sort of look forward, and I'm kind of smiling too because I'm looking over at one of my research managers over there, and we did a bunch of work on ERCOT post-Uri, right? And one of the things that we were constantly confounded with is really getting detailed information about what happened at different locations.
Good luck.
So yeah, exactly. It makes for some interesting space for us, I guess, to explore here. When you think about Winter Storm Uri and you think about all of the lessons learned, I think most people who have done a deep dive on this understand it's not because the wind didn't blow. It's not pointing fingers and blaming one thing. It was sort of a cataclysmic event that was driven by a number of different things. But in terms of what it means for lessons learned, I wonder if you could both expand on that from your own perspectives in terms of what happened. And I'll start with you, Marianne.
So, I mentioned we dispatch over 100 power stations. 52 of those were in Texas the week of the storm. Wind, solar, batteries, a lot of natural gas that couldn't get fuel. I think, lessons learned, and I do think the governor's office and the PUC and ERCOT has done a lot of really good work to address the communication issues between we were siloed. You got the Railroad Commission, the Public Utility Commission, you got ERCOT, you got stakeholders, and there was not an easy way to communicate what was happening across. And I think there was, even at some pretty high levels, a lack of appreciation for how intertwined our gas markets and our power markets are. You got to, 1 o'clock in the morning Monday, and as that cold front had gone so far south to Corpus and Brownsville, farther south than it had expected to go, and colder, and the EIA has a great map, and it shows home heating fuel type by county. And the farther south in Texas you go, the less natural gas interconnection and the more baseboard electric heating. And when that cold front hit Corpus and everybody's baseboard electric heaters, you can see the load pick up. And at that point, there was nothing else to turn on, and the wires companies quickly had to start shedding load. And we saw customers who were on the critical list who did get shed. And picking up like, you got to turn us back on. We're feeding power stations. If you don't turn us on, these power stations, and we saw power stations trip on low fuel supply pressure. So this communication thing has to be really honed in on. And I think one of the problems we'll have is the next event It won't be weather, it'll be cyber or some, it's going to be something else. And how we do our disaster planning and worst case scenarios, human beings, we love to underestimate the probability of bad things happening. We tend to be very optimistic creatures. And so to force yourself to start thinking scenario analysis of what could happen, what does it look like, I think we have got to do a much better job of how we communicate with one another. A lesson I learned during the storm, years ago, because like I said, I've been doing this a really long time, ERCOT had a requirement, you had to have a copper phone on your real-time desks, and it couldn't run through a computer. And ERCOT once a year would come audit and make sure that your hard, old school phone that does not need electricity to work between us and ERCOT was there. They've eliminated that requirement. So I was like, well, where's the red phone? And they said, Marianne, when we moved downtown, we didn't redo the copper phone. I was like, well, how are we supposed to call the power stations if there's a blackout? Well, cell phones. I was like, okay, that's good for a couple hours till your battery's dead. I mean, we have got to do a better job. I really worry that in energy transition, and we are electrifying everything, that the role of reliability on our power grids is becoming more and more and more critical. It's already critical, but I think it could be orders of magnitude worse if we're not very careful on how we design that. And one of my pet peeves is people who say we had a blackout. We did not have a blackout. We had rolling brownouts, and the rolling was really long, in some places several days. But we kept our critical infrastructure energized, hospitals, nursing homes. If we had had a true failure of the power grid, and we were 3 minutes from Comanche Peak tripping on low frequency, and if that had happened, there was nothing else to protect it, and we would have seen I mean, I get goosebumps just saying those words out loud. 3 minutes from a blackout in the state, and then you find out post that of the black start units, because most people don't realize power stations need to be plugged in to turn on. And we had 13 black start units, and a bunch of them were out during the storm because of impacts from the storm. So I've heard numbers, and it's not official, but I've heard up to 8 of the 13 were unavailable.
You mentioned something there about expanding electrification, and just to ground this, when you look at the rate of electrification across the United States, not just Texas, but the U.S. as a whole, it's increased significantly just over the last 30 years, and it's going to continue to increase. We've gone from on the order of about 30% of total primary energy use is electricity to a little over 44 to 45%. Now imagine doubling that and thinking about what Marianne just laid out. It's a tremendous task, quite frankly. So without a doubt, reliability and resilience are going to become increasingly important.
You can't even wash your hands in a restroom now without electricity. And when you put your hands underneath it, most of the time it still doesn't work. You don't know if it's the power or the water. But so the lessons that I have learned from this, so I was not in my role during the outage. I had 5 days without power. I had 2 days without water. It made me really go back and think about the interdependencies associated with the system. So power goes out, ultimately water goes out, the banking system goes out. The other things that we need in our system go out. So resiliency, reliability at the electric level is really more important than anything. We found water systems. We've historically had challenges with water systems and hurricanes. After a couple days, we get them back up. But this really shed light on a lot of water systems had backup diesel generators. They didn't work. They may have tested them, once a year, but there's water in the diesel and the plant didn't work. And we have to do better. And unfortunately, it takes an event like this to really put the focus on we are an amazing society in terms of our technology and innovation, but to lose all that, it made me feel like, what do I have? I have nothing. I think this is going to be a long-term modification to the way we work in the power system. I really do. Many years ago, I led the investigation of a blackout in the northeastern United States, about 50 million people. in 2003. And before we were investigating it, we spent some time with the National Transportation Safety Board, and we were asking them about, so how do you investigate these things? What do you look for, and how far do you go back? And they basically said, look, any investigation that they have is not just for the day that the event happened. You have to look days, hours, days, weeks, and months beforehand. And that is the same thing that we had here. We had lots of challenges that got swept under the rug, communications issues, firm fuel transportation issues on the gas pipeline, on intrastate versus interstate. We had, icing blades on wind. We had coal stacks that froze. We knew all of these things could happen. We just didn't expect them to happen in the same storm. So learning the interdependencies, cybersecurity, I agree. That's my big fear. Cybersecurity and how we resolve that if something happens or when something happens is the event that I'm fearful of.
So y'all have both referenced interdependence, and I want to come back to the cyber issue because I think that's a really important one as well. But the interdependence of the natural gas system in Texas and the power system in Texas is not something I would argue anybody really fully understood unless they were in it. And the fact that you had compressor stations being cut, right, as you started to see load shed orders issued, and that then of course led to the downward spiral we ended up in because gas couldn't get to where it was needed to generate power. When you think about those sorts of things, I guess the question I have is why wasn't this known beforehand, right? And how do we prevent something like that from happening again? And I know that's sort of like asking an impossible question, but literally, what did we learn from it, and how can we make sure that, or at least minimize the risk that something like that happens again?
Well, if you want me to start, I mean, we've already begun that process with the Railroad Commission to understand what are the critical, we have a mapping committee that's being developed. They're going to develop this structure of maps where we look at the most needed gas fields in the state that are producing the gas that goes into the pipelines that goes to the power plants. So we have to understand where those reservoirs are and under what conditions they are being run and under what types of pumps and pressure stations are being used to push that into these power plants. That's happening. The other thing that I've noticed, we talk about the gas industry, like it's just one part, it's just one industry. Well, you have small producers, you have big producers, you have different producers in every reservoir, every basin. You have midstream companies, you have large-scale transportation companies, intrastate, interstate. These are all different parts. So for us, for a power plant owner, you were primarily talking to an inter or an intrastate pipeline, and that's it. So what it has forced you to do is think beyond that. So who are the people that are supplying that? How do we make sure that they, or our contracts, our firm contracts with the pipeline companies, are we going to ask them to make sure they're looking back at the producers in the basins to make sure that they have something firm? It has spurred these questions. So I think it's the beginning of that process. I think there's an obligation to serve in the electric business. We kind of all feel like we have to serve. That's kind of grown out of the utility mindset that you are a regulated monopoly and for your return on an investment you have to serve. There's not really that in the producer space. They provide molecules for a lot of different things. And rightfully, they've never been put in that position. So they're exporting, they're providing fuel for feedstocks. They're not only power plants, but other feedstocks. So the conversation will help that. We're blessed that we have all those pipelines, all those reservoirs in the state, and I do believe that we will make sure that those links happen. So
before you go, Marianne, storage. So there is a lot of natural gas storage in Texas. Max send out when it's full is roughly 17 Bs a day. Why couldn't that bridge the gap?
Well, do you mean on that day?
On that, yeah, exactly.
Well, I think what you found is that the pipeline compressors didn't have electricity, or there wasn't enough in storage to get it out close enough to the to the power plant. So part of the mapping committee is looking at that, looking where the storage reservoirs are around the state. You know, the reservoirs on the Gulf Coast, the salt domes, they're fantastic, but they're only on our part of the state. You know, so what happens in other parts of the state? So I think we have to look at all of those things, but I think you're not the only one who scratches your head like, why couldn't all of that, you know, supplied the gas we need that day? But
it's just, it speaks to interconnectivity again. That's really the point, Marianne.
I would add, though, there are some great success stories that I think there's some unsung heroes through this. Infrastructure. So if you think 20 years ago, most of our compressors were gas. And to reduce emissions, we've converted them to electric. There are ways, and Energy Transfer has some great technology where they have dual drives where they run on electric, but they can, in an outage, they can provide demand response and other things, switch over to the gas in the pipeline. They actually use it to feed the compressors.
Redundancy. It came up this morning, right?
And flexibility. And if you say, well, why doesn't everybody do that? Well, it costs more to build. And so depending on your sophistication and your understanding of how complex and intertwined gas and power are in our state, some folks have had the wherewithal to say, hey, I want to be able to have that flexibility built into my compressor station so I can optimize against energy prices, but also have the ability to continue to compress gas and move it when there are outages. So there are technologies. I think part of it is saying, hey, critical loads, I need you to have some redundancy and require it. Prior to Senate Bill 7 and deregulation/competition, you know, you had a handful of big utilities, and they were very focused on reliability and regulated rate of return and putting things in the cost base. When you get as many market participants as we have in Texas today, I think the obligation, the sense of I'm in charge of making sure everything's going to be okay in every situation is watered down, because you're in a much bigger pool with lots and lots of people, and you're thinking, what are the chances all of us are going to have issues at the same time? And it comes back to this. Uri, you know, was just such an amazing, geographically broad, impactful event that it took everybody's contingency plans out, and you know, we were lucky to get through it. Virtually, I was going to say unscathed, and that's not the right word either, because you know, people died. It was a really, really awful event.
It was cataclysmic, to say the least. But hopefully we did learn the right lessons coming out of it. And I want to get to cyber now, because you both mentioned that. And I guess sort of again asking you to look in your crystal ball and determine what you don't know. But when you think about cyber right now, what's your biggest concern, and how can we address it, right, in terms of regulatory policy, private enterprise? What can be done?
I'll start, and I do worry about cyber. It's what keeps me up at night. Given the number of power stations and critical loads that we dispatch through our SCADA systems, you know, you're only as strong as one SCADA engineer. And everybody's like, oh, the hackers can get in. Oh no, you employ the wrong person and they have access to your SCADA. You can open breakers. I think that in general, because most Americans don't think about the infrastructure and all of the people that work real hard to keep the lights on, it's not something that's front of mind as far as hardening our power grids. About a year ago, I was with some senators and congressmen, and they were talking about cyber and how important. I said, you know, it's not just cyber, it's the entire. And they were like, what do you mean? I said, you know, I had a boss at Reliant who told me, Marianne, we could take down the power grid with some pickup trucks and rope. And I was like, what? He goes, go drive through Texas and see 345 kV lines. There's nothing protecting them. You get a couple pickup trucks and some rope, and you can take the backbone out of our power grid. You know, we have got to start thinking about, if people truly wanted to harm us, making sure that, again, I think it goes back to all of the scenario analysis. So to me, first is protecting transmission and making sure. And I've heard people, yeah, with guns you can take out some. It scares me. Now on the cyber, you know, they're already here. I mean, there have been examples going back a decade of hackers going in and opening, you know, dams, and I do think we need to be much more hard on our utilities and our market participants around cybersecurity. And you look at what happened with the Colonial Pipeline. I mean, that's a small fraction of what could happen if somebody gets in to the ERCOT systems, which you mentioned is an IT, and they've got, they really do have incredible people, but do you think they're competing against, you know, Russian hackers right now trying to protect the infrastructure of our grid? And how do we make sure that ERCOT has the resources to defend?
So that begs the question, maybe Jimmy, you can speak to this a little bit too, but the financial services sector has a collaborative organization that shares information on cyber threats and the best practices to avoid them. The nuclear industry does the same thing. Why hasn't that filtered out into thinking about, you know, our regional transmission organizations and independent system operator operations?
Well, we do have a cyber, it's the electric ISAC, which is part of the Department of Homeland Security, and they do a lot of that. I think the cool thing is, you all need to know that a lot of stuff is going on, and the fact that you can't see it is probably a good thing. I kind of think like, you know, when I was a little kid, I was like, I wanted to know a CIA agent, and I didn't know if I did, but they might have been right there. And it's kind of the same thing, you know. You may have some cyber guy sitting next to you, and you don't even know it, but, right. So the cyber issue to me is, you know, a cyber attack only has to be right one time. We have to be right 100% of the time to stop it. So the response and the efforts to block that have to be even more robust, and that's a hard thing to handle. I believe that the power system, the way that it was built, the fabric that the system was built on was about redundancy. So we are going to have challenges. Hopefully our redundancy will pay off, where you might take out elements of the system, but you won't take down the entire system. This becomes exponentially harder as you have power walls in your home and Teslas that are two-way, pulling power off the system, putting power on the system and pulling it off. Everything becomes an element of the system that you could actually maneuver your way through. So it is going to get harder, but I think you know, we don't see the issues that come up every day that are stopped, or, you know, the notices that go out about this, that, and the other, and that's a good thing. But our folks that are in this space are really, really smart and really doing great work, and it's just you know, it is the 24/7, 365 job that we all kind of laugh about, but it is that one.
I'm glad you mentioned the "we don't know about" part, because I can tell you, and some of my students are in the room, they can probably verify this, but I've talked to them about how when there's you know, a load shed ordered in a hot summer day in August, most of us never know it because there's actually some demand side management response, and that's important, but it's also important that everybody understands what's going on the grid so they can actually act accordingly. Now, you've mentioned something that both of y'all mentioned, something that I want to dive into next, which is really about resource integration and what that means for the grid of the future. I'm glad we've talked about transmission, because it always seems to be the thing that gets kind of left. It's the afterthought in many conversations around the future of the grid, but it's incredibly important. Jimmy, you just mentioned, you know, battery walls, Teslas that pull in and you know, and put back to the grid. You could talk about, you know, solar on rooftops that is actually, you know, you've got to have bidirectional capability and what that means for load management and grid management and everything else. But that means we're integrating a giant, diverse set of new resources into the grid. And when we think about how we manage that grid, right, just if you could put on your, you know, I'm going to look forward 30 years and think about what that might look like. I think that would be really great. I asked a similar question to some other folks this morning, right, about what 2050 looks like regionally. Now I want to kind of drill down and think about what does it look like when we're talking about the grid, and particularly in Texas.
I'll go first. I think you're going to have many more batteries at the distribution system level. I think what you're seeing is this. Historically, power plants, big central station power plants, were built outside of cities with transmission lines to bring them to the load in the cities. We've continually grown out to rural areas, and now we encompass many of those. We get with gas-fired power plants, it was always gas, water, electricity. Transmission line, gas and water. That's the place to build a power plant. Wind, it was always go out to the site. What I see is with solar and batteries, it's coming back towards the load. So it's coming back into the urban areas and moving back towards the cities. So we will continue to have to move power around. That means we need a more robust transmission system. The distribution system has to be upgraded a lot more. So we're going to see a lot of two-way power flows. We're going to see a lot more data. We're going to see, I mean, I don't even know if we're going to have small modular reactors or not, but I hope we do in some fashion. The technology that's forever 20 years away or 10 years away, but there is going to be a lot of new exciting stuff at the house level, at the neighborhood level, I think, as we go to 2050. And who knows, cars, they may be the power plants of the future. Who knows?
So 2050, I think, Jimmy and I are sitting here in our rocking chairs saying, remember when we used to burn hydrocarbons to make electricity? How we get there, though, I've got a new challenge for everybody, and we talk a lot about oil and gas. And Kay and I were sitting next to each other at dinner on Tuesday this week, or Wednesday, one of the days, and talking about how there's this perception that the renewable industry and the oil and gas industry can't stand one another and aren't going to collaborate. And I can tell you, having worked at Exxon and worked with EDF, it's not the case. We've got really smart people, and to help get rid of some of that divisiveness as we move forward into this next energy transition space, I think we have to start divorcing oil and gas. That ampersand in between oil and gas has got to go. And I get when you drill for oil, you get some gas associated. I totally understand the engineering behind that. But if you think about the future path for oil, transportation, electrification of our transportation fleet, which is the next big move. If you can get our big oil majors to work with transportation fleets and infrastructure, charging, lessons learned of what we have done over the last several decades, you get some collaboration going, and I think we can really accelerate that transition. With natural gas and thinking about it as a feedstock for electricity and power, having natural gas and wind and solar, this intermittency starting to work together about where do we need to have this dispatchable resource, and how can we look to reduce carbon emissions, but in a very smart, strategic way. And it rolls off the tongue, oil and gas. But I would tell you, 40 years ago, beer and cigarettes was exactly the same thing. Beer and cigarettes prices trended together. They lobbied together. You get Fred Flintstone and Barney Rubble sitting in the bar and smoking their cigarettes. You would never see Anheuser-Busch and Philip Morris lobbying together today. It can happen. The divorce can happen. And I think if we take away that ampersand, we can start having some really meaningful conversations about what is the role in oil moving forward, and transportation and electrification, and what is the role for natural gas and having a cleaner, reliable power grid of the future. So that's my challenge. No more ampersand.
That's really interesting. I'll just shameless plug again for the Baker Institute Center for Energy Studies, but we actually do have roundtables that are Chatham House Rules discussions on the future of oil as energy transitions and the future of gas as energy transitions, and they are separate things. And it's interesting because the people at those tables are very different, right? So to your point, very well taken. So I asked 2050 for a very specific reason, and it's kind of a funny one that was cemented into me by one of my advisors when I was doing my doctorate. I was struggling to get my work done, and he kept asking me, why aren't you finished? The theory's great, the model's great. I said, well, I don't like the outcome. And finally he sat me down and he said, Ken, just get this finished. I said, well, I don't think it's right. He said, it doesn't matter. He said, you learned a lesson by going through the experiment, right? And that's the point. But besides that, you're not going to be right no matter what you say when you're thinking about the future. And nobody's going to remember what you said a year from now. So There you go. We can come back in a year and talk about this again. So with that, everybody join me in thanking Mary Ann and Jimmy for being up on stage. And Kay, do you want to come up and make a few remarks as we close?
Hello. Yes, Kay McCall again, Executive Director of the Renewable Energy Alliance, and I just have a couple of remarks to say. First, a big thank you to Ken and the staff at the Baker Institute for partnering with us on this event as a basically year-and-a-half-old organization to be able to do an event like this with something as well-known and frankly prestigious as the Baker Institute is a real honor for us, and we thank you for that, Ken. I would be remiss if I didn't say thank you to another couple of people. I don't know if they're still in the room because they've been working all day, but Ryan Scott and Rachel Edwards from HBW worked tirelessly on this. John Northington from the Consumer Energy Alliance also worked a lot to put the speakers together. And I think you guys can see they did a fabulous job of putting together blue ribbon panels today, so thank you to them for that. Just another couple of words about the Renewable Energy Alliance. I came into it after it was already conceptualized, and the myths and the stories about Skelly roping me into it are entirely true. I had come off a stint as the CEO of a wind energy company, could have moved anywhere in the world. I'd been on the East Coast for a decade, and by God, I came back to Houston because Houston feels like home to me. And for the first time in 10 years, my entire family was together. My son, my daughter, my grandkids, the whole thing. And I came back and I said, you know what? I love this stupid city. I don't know why, but I want my kids to be able to have the great time that I've had in Houston and to have the fantastic opportunities, economic and lifestyle and everything else that I've had. I want them to have that, but that's not going to happen if Houston doesn't approach the future with great intention. Because it may be truly the oil and gas capital, it has to be the energy capital. And it will become the energy capital because we intend it to be the energy capital. And at that time, back in 2020, when we started this, like January, nobody told me there was going to be a pandemic, but okay, let's just go ahead and launch a nonprofit anyway. But not for nothing, we had a few companies step up that were incredible. And I see Archie Fallon's here from Willkie Farr. We had, you guys heard Carrie Kotler from Pattern, Mary Ann from EDF, John Berger from Sonova. And again, Ryan Scott from HBW, they answered the call, and really the six of us just kind of friggin' figured it out. And I will tell you, every one of them did it because they love this stupid city also. And they see economic opportunities, yes, but if you talk to them, you'll find out they're really passionate about Houston maintaining and elevating its status. And it's been a tremendous ride, and today is really a very special day for us. We now have 26 corporate sponsors, several of whom you heard from today. We continue to find others, and the theme is we believe in Houston, we believe in synergies, not silos. Like Mary Ann said, we got to cut this crap about any kind of disagreement or name calling or anything. I was on a panel 3 weeks ago, and I was the only one from Houston. It was in Houston. The other two were from another city, but it's a state capital, but I won't name it. And they were talking about, oh, you know, everybody in renewable energy trash talks people in oil and gas. And I said, that is not true. I've been in the renewable energy industry for 20 years. I was in the oil and gas industry before that for the same amount of time, pretty much. I'm that old, for sure. And I said, because here in Houston, we're neighbors. You know, when Harvey hits, we're helping. I mean, it's just not true. So if you're in oil and gas, you have a company in oil and gas, and you think, oh, well, you know, I'll never find a synergy, or who the hell wants to deal with those people, I got to tell you, it's a pretty nice group of people. So feel free to come join us, and let's find ways to develop synergies. For my fellow boomers, Our time of control is over. Our time for coaching and collaboration is here. When we talk about 2050, I'm pushing up daisies in 2050, folks. Or my kids have got me rolled out on the patio somewhere. These decisions that need to be made, these important, incredibly difficult decisions that need to be made, need to have input from the people who are going to be most impacted. We need Rice, we need U of H, we need Texas Southern, we need A&M, we need St. Thomas, we need all this incredible young talent that we have joining with us as we help you develop that leadership position, because energy is very personal. As if you didn't know before Uri or Harvey or any other time, it's a very personal thing. In Houston, it's personal not just because we care about whether the lights are on, but it's jobs. It's financial comfort and stability for our families. And so my call to action for the younger group, which at my age is anybody 40 and younger, you're like younger, is please engage in this effort, because this is going to be something that's going to be huge in the quality of your life and the life of your children. For those of us who are on the other side of our career, we got to help them. And we got to provide the support, we got to provide the guidance, but we have to also realize that what they want matters a great deal. And so sometimes you got to set aside your own view and do the best you can to equip these people as they come up and they take over. And we have some great mentors who are all on the panel today. At Renewable Energy Alliance, we got a lot of other people, sponsors, who are happy and enjoy talking with these younger generations. So I ask you to really reach out. I know a lot of you, I love these guys who are Rice. I know how much I love coming here and talking to them, and it's a thrill to see people in person. But please do get engaged. For those of us, like I said, who are older, we still have something. And this is another thing, young folk, don't think just because we're older we can't help you, because we can. And we will. But appreciate what Rice is doing, what the Baker Institute is doing, and our other higher ed institutions, as they are making a pivot themselves. And this is something that takes time, but they're making it a priority. I heard Ken and others from Rice speak at Sarah Week, and what they're doing at Rice is really interesting and exciting in the energy area. But anyway, that's really all I wanted to say. Big thank you to everybody. Renewable Energy Alliance, you can find us at renewableenergyhouston.org. You can find us on LinkedIn. Follow us, let us know what other kind of content you'd like to see. But again, thank you for participating. Thank you.